Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the program today. Figured it's just about 12 o'clock Eastern. We might as well get started with the program as we do have some additional doctors joining us as well as we proceed. But thank you for everyone for joining us today. Welcome to the program on negotiating or renegotiating the terms in rent in your dental office lease. My name is Ryan Cathers. I'm a senior consultant in the healthcare leasing division here at Cirrus Consulting Group, and I have the pleasure of speaking and presenting today for all of you. Now, just before we really get started into some of the program and the information, I think it's very important that we go through a little bit of background of Cirrus. So a little bit of who we are, what we do, and how we support the dental community across North America. So Cirrus, we are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm. Now we've actually been around for a little over 24 years now. Now it's founded originally by dentists for dentists back in 1994. And we've now negotiated over 10,000 dental and medical leases since inception. To give you an idea in terms of how our firm is structured, we have everything in-house. So we have an in-house legal, leasing, and consulting team. Our legal team is comprised of highly experienced real estate attorneys with a background of healthcare and tenant representation. We have an in-house leasing team who have access to rent rates and comparables in any given market across the country. And we have an in-house consulting team that work alongside the legal and leasing team to essentially help devise a strategy for the negotiation. So we're really structured to help support the dentists across all facets of the commercial real estate. On an annual basis, we represent over 1,000 doctors throughout North America. We deliver over 100 continuing education courses, whether it's in the form of webinars or seminars across the country. And we lecture at most of the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York Pacific Dental Conference, the Yankee Dental Conference, California Dental Association, and others as well. So we really truly work with dentists nationwide. I had our leasing team pull a report of some of the recent customers and clients that we've had and supported through their negotiation or renegotiation of their office lease, and had them presented here today for you to view. Now, I thought as we're on a program for real estate, obviously there is the legal aspect, but as well as many of you are interested on market updates. What are current rental rates, comparables, what is fair market? So I had our leasing team pull a few examples across the country to give you an idea of the different types of markets and where the market's at. So for example, in Boston, the average rental rate in Boston currently is about $44 a square foot. Now again, that can be attributed to location, area, type of building, type of tenancies that are on the property. But to give you a bit of an average, and the vacancy rate right now is sitting about 6.75%. And you notice it's a bit of a supply and demand chart. So obviously as vacancies decrease, rents increase. In Chicago, rental rates are hovering around the $19.50 a square foot as vacancies go down. In Orlando, about $23 a square foot, And you'll notice near the end, not similar to the previous charts where the vacancy rate is increasing, so you'll notice the rents are decreasing. As you can imagine, when there is more supply, less demand. And finally, on the West Coast in California, we have some San Francisco averages. So right now, it's averaging a little over $31 a square foot. Now in California, it does work a little bit differently, or they refer to the per square foot, actually on a monthly basis as opposed to a yearly basis. For any of you that are out on the West Coast in California, it's hovering about $1.58 a square foot. Now the purpose of today's webinar is threefold. So firstly, my goal through this webinar is to teach you the importance of the office lease agreement. Secondly, we're going to go through a few key terms and conditions within your office lease and how they'll impact you as a tenant. And some practical advice on negotiating the lease agreement. Give you, tips and tricks, so to speak, to put you in the driver's seat in the negotiation or the renegotiation of your office lease. Now, I know many of you have been, whether it's considering now, in the future, in the past, buying property and the real estate versus leasing or renting the real estate. So many of you may have heard the term of owner-occupant, meaning you practice out of the space that you own. There's pros and cons of each side. Every day I'm asked, should I buy or should I lease? Depends case by case. What is the opportunity? Does it make sense from a financial standpoint? So in terms of buying, it requires large upfront financial investment. You become a landlord. So I advise doctors across the country that it's not just an investment in terms of a monetary value. It is another job. What happens if the HVAC system breaks down? Who's responsible for it? You're the landlord. As long as someone knows that going in, you're essentially having two jobs, as a practice owner and as a landlord, whether it's single tenant or multi-tenant building. You earn rental income from the real estate aspect. Greater flexibility on how to use the space. You don't need permission to make alterations. And you have the freedom to control the property of who comes in, who comes out, and what you want to do with it. On the leasing side, it requires smaller upfront payment. You have greater working capital to work with towards building out the practice because you're not spending on the real estate. And you have the flexibility to relocate or expand the practice. So if things change, you now vision a different type of practice or different location. It's much easier to relocate when you don't own the property as well. But in either case, again, my goal today is to teach you the importance of the dental office lease, whether you are an owner-occupant or you are a tenant of the building. Now, what is a lease? Generally, I ask this question at my seminar that I host throughout the country, and ask doctors just like yourself, what is a lease? What is the first thing that comes to mind? Now, since this is a one-way communication, I'll answer it for you. There's typically two different answers that I get, and they're both right. One, a lease is an agreement or a relationship, if you will, to put together between a landlord and a tenant, and what that relationship is, who's responsible for what, and so forth. The second aspect of the lease that many doctors think of first and foremost is the check you have to write each month. And I'm sure many of you have thought or thinking or could be potentially overpaying in rent. or it's this monetary value that you hate paying each month. No one likes to pay it. But this is the main aspect that someone looks at. It is the most expensive check you will ever write. When I ask in my seminars, what is the most expensive check or investment you make in your life, most dentists will reply with their house, their home. True for most professions. In the dental community, it's the dental practice. The amount of money that you're committing to a landlord over the course of your career is extremely substantial, because you're not only looking to sign a lease for 1 or 2 years. When you invest into this practice, whether you're looking to start up or acquire the practice, you're looking to stay there for the long term. So when we're committing to 10-year leases, 5-year leases, that's not just X amount of money per month, that dollar figure. We add that up over the course of the term. And plus, if you're not looking to relocate, which even if you did, there's some sort of money paid each month, that's for the career. So again, it is the most expensive check you will ever write. So my goal today is to teach you the lease is critical and that it's not all about rent. If rent is used properly, it puts you in a position to win. Rent is one of the variables you can use as leverage in the negotiations with your landlord. This is where most dentists lose in the negotiation. Now, I'm not trying to say we should be paying substantially more in rent. I'm just saying, if used properly, it can put you in the right position to win in the negotiations. Why is the office lease so important? Your office location is the foundation of your practice. In short, no location, no business, no patience, no cash flow. The office and location is the foundation of your practice. It's the investment and cost to build. The amount of capital that's put into a dental practice for plumbing, leasehold improvements, etc. It's immense. Dental tenants on a per square foot basis are one of the highest, if not the highest, expenses as a tenant across the board, because you put so much value and investment into the building and the build out, which also means it's very difficult, expensive, and time consuming to move. Landlords also know this. Most dentists don't look to relocate the practice or a practice unless there's a very specific reason or are forced to. We're looking to stay for the long haul, which is why it's imperative that we take a look at exactly what is in our lease. Most dentists, and as I lecture across the country, I've been in a room with 40 dentists before, and when I asked how many doctors in here have read their lease cover to cover, I've had times where not a single dentist has raised their hands. Times where there's 1 or 2 dentists that raise their hands, all focused on rent. Just had a doctor I was speaking with where doctor's about 56 years old, nearing the end of his career, had not read his lease. Landlord decided to redevelop the property, terminate his lease, These now had to move out before September. Not an investment you want to make at that stage of your career. And finally, the lease is pivotal in the practice sale. There are terms and provisions within the lease that can make or break the sale of your practice. It just depends if you want your lease to act as an asset or a liability throughout not only your career, but as you look to transition as well. What are 3 key saleable components of your practice? 1, being the equipment and the depreciated value. 2, the goodwill or the patients. And 3, being the lease agreement. Now, by no means am I implying here that the lease is more important than the patients or the goodwill in terms of evaluation, because I truly believe the dentist is the most important part of a dental practice. They're the reasons why the patients come back. But it plays a pivotal role in the transition and the sale of the dental practice, even in the evaluation. And to clarify, I don't mean it's considered 50% of the evaluation. What I mean is it can affect 100% of the sale. Meaning, if you were looking to sell your practice for example, $1 million, the lease can impact 100% of that evaluation. It's not valued the $1 million, but the lease can impact 100% of that evaluation. So it's absolutely critical that we know what is in our lease and how it can impact us. What should your office lease do for you? Well, firstly, provide fair and affordable financial terms. And I'm not just referring to rent. Rent is obviously a big part of it. It's one of our biggest expenses as a dental office. Obviously, salaries and sundries aside. Typically the third highest expense. And so we should have fair and affordable financial terms. Most of you are most likely on what's called a triple net lease, meaning there's 3 aspects included into additional costs of the building on top of rent, meaning taxes, insurance, and maintenance, also known as common area maintenance. We need to ensure that we're receiving detailed and itemized statements at the end of each year, outlining and breaking down the specific expenses of the building, what they were, when they were occurred, and who they were occurred to. So that way we know what we're actually paying for. It's not just a general reconciliation statement. We had a doctor we were speaking with out in Denver, and he found his common area maintenance charges very high. When they were eventually looked into in more detail, they found out that the landlord was utilizing his brother's company for snow removal and charging 4 times the price of the average snow removal company. That is something we want control over. Tenant improvement allowance. Knowing that the more tenant improvement allowance that we take from the landlord, the more inflated your rental rate will be. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should never take any tenant improvement allowance. Absolutely not. We just want to be cognizant of the value and how it impacts our rental rates, not only for that first year, but over the course of that term, but as well as the renewals. Landlords bake that value, whether it's $10 a square foot, $50 a square foot, $75 a square foot. They bake that value back into the rent rates. We should be looking to sign long-term leases for stability and security. In most cases, we generally recommend signing a 10-year term with 2 or 3 5-year renewal options for a couple different reasons. One, it provides long-term security for the practice and the dentist as you practice through your career for 20 years of predictability plus, but as well as when you're looking to sell your practice, your buyer will need that type of runway to acquire it. Not only for their predictability, so it's attractive to a buyer, but if they need to secure financing from a lender or a bank, banks typically need now 8 to 10 years of term on the lease, whether that's in the form of initial term or options, to finance an acquisition. Now we want to be careful there. We will touch on the option language in a few moments as well, because we need to ensure that they are transferable or included in the sale and need to be properly structured before the sale happens. Long-term leases also provide us as a dental tenant with leverage in the negotiations. Not many types of tenants look to sign long-term leases. So it's very attractive for a landlord to hear we're looking to commit for a 10-year term. And not in all cases is a 10-year term recommended. It obviously depends on the doctor and what we're looking to do. But in most cases, and it's like buying in bulk. Typically the longer term or more you're buying, the better deal that you get. We need to minimize risk and exposure. Many of you may or may not know, but as you read the name tenant on your lease and the tenancy, it will have your name personally. I want to make this name up, Dr. John Smith as an individual named as a tenant. And you'll notice in all of your leases, on the landlord's entity, it's all a corporation. We need to be minimizing our risk and exposure, especially personally, and separating our personal assets from our business assets. We need to ensure we have flexibility. We had a doctor who had signed a 10-year lease, as per the recommendation he had seen in a webinar, and two years into the 10-year lease, doctor got in his car one day on his way to work, and unfortunately there was a car accident. 2 years into a 10-year lease. The landlord was going after the final 8 years of his estate. Because there was no death and disability provision built in to the lease, the family didn't have any ability to terminate the lease and minimize their risk and exposure. They didn't have the flexibility to get out of that agreed upon term. The death and disability provision essentially states, God forbid something happens to you and you're no longer able to practice, you have the ability to terminate the lease. This particular provision is actually how we got our name about 24 years ago. Having it properly structured provides you with protections. Personally, and from the business standpoint, to protect your family. So this should be incorporated into every single lease as protections, including the right of first refusal as an expansion option. If we're looking to potentially grow in the practice, we should be incorporating this type of provision in, so the landlord has to come to you first prior to any of their tenants and prior to listing the space publicly to offer you the space. Not an obligation, but an offer. And finally, to enhance your ability to sell your dental practice. So ideally, doctors, your lease should not only provide all the above, but it should enhance and facilitate the sale of your practice. By having all of the above, your lease will begin to function as an asset as opposed to a liability when you sell your practice. It's about getting as much mileage as you can with your lease, just like anything else in life. You know, your car, we take it for proper oil changes to ensure that it lasts. Very similar to your lease. What's in your lease? So here's one of the provisions. It's called the option to renew provision. This provision essentially, as your initial term comes up for expiry, many of you may or may not have what's called an option to renew or an option to extend, which essentially states you give the landlord X amount of notice, depending on what's written in the lease, and your term will automatically extend based on what it is, whether it's an extra 5 years, what have you. The only aspects that really change in the lease are term and rent, and how rent is determined. So this is one of the provisions that we're going to go through today, and this language and verbiage is found in 90% of the leases we review and have to negotiate. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, we now represent over 1,000 doctors each year, and this is found in 90% of them. Negotiated majority, quote unquote, by doctors, by dental-specific real estate attorneys. So as we go through, take a moment to read, and we're going to go walk right through them. The first problematic aspect of this provision is in the first sentence. Provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as tenant. Meaning, this option to renew is personal to Dr. Joe Black. So when he looks to sell the practice, these options do not transfer to the buyer, meaning it can be detrimental to the sale because the buyer could not get financing. And as well, it's not as attractive because there may not be as much runway as the buyer would hope for predictability for themselves when they take over the practice. We had a doctor email in at the end of March. He had negotiated his lease X amount of time ago, and he was able to negotiate an option personal to him. He's conditionally sold his practice based on the 5-year option transferring to the buyer. The landlord was leveraging the amendment in the lease to allow the option to transfer to the buyer and was asking for $120,000 just to transfer the option to renew. Because it wasn't properly structured the first time, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do. So we need to ensure our options are transferable. In many cases, they're not as obvious as stating Dr. Joe Black. In many cases, you'll notice the T in the tenant is capitalized. It's a defined term, meaning somewhere in the lease, that word has been defined. And in the tenant's case, it's typically on the very first page. So many won't have the doctor's personal name, but will have it referring to the tenant. That is, again, personal to you. It goes on to say, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. I'm sure now many of you have noticed the word default, how it's a capitalized term. It's defined. And I hope many of you, if not all of you, have read through your default sections of your lease. As quote unquote from a doctor in one of my seminars, there can be some silly things in that provision. And I'm not just talking about rent. Rent is obviously the most common. But there are many other aspects that can hold you in default that you may or may not even realize. We received a call from a doctor a couple months ago where she was looking to renew her lease. About 9 years ago, she had signed her 10-year term with 2 5-year renewal options. She went to express her renewal, her first 5-year option, and the landlord said, no, we don't wish to renew you as a tenant. Obviously, she was turning every color in the rainbow. I received her call, and we asked her the general questions: have you paid your bills? Is there any reason why they wouldn't want you as a tenant? Couldn't think of anything. So we approached the landlord and asked them why. They sent us a picture and an article number. The picture was of the front door of her office, of the practice, that outlined the business hours of the practice. 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday, closed Fridays. We went to the article number referenced to her lease. Under the default section was normal business hours. The normal business hours for the plaza was to be 9 to 6, Monday to Friday, 10 to 4 on Saturday. Because her business was not open the required hours, they held her in default. And we're leveraging that not to renew her. Now, they said openly they loved her as a tenant. She was great. The problem was a Panera Bread wanted her space and was willing to pay 40% more in rent. The point is, doctors, you should be very familiar with what's in your default section of your lease, because there's many other types of provisions that constitute a default. It goes on to say, it shall have the option to renew this lease for a further term of 5 years, exercisable by written notice to the landlord no less than 9 months prior to the end of the term. Meaning you need to express your option by written notice to the landlord not less than 9 months prior to the end of the term. If you miss that date, 9 months prior, your options become null and void. They don't exist. So when we're taking a look at critical dates, we're not only taking a look at the expiry of the lease. We're taking a look at the option to renew deadline. Because time is leverage as a dental tenant. And it's key to know your critical dates so we know how much time we have. So this should be circled in everyone's calendar. Some may be 3 months, some 6 months, 9, 12. In some cases they say between 9 and 12, some sort of combination. But it should absolutely be circled in each and every one of our calendars. It goes on to say, any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. Meaning you express your renewal to stay. Landlord hands you a new lease and you must sign. They can make whatever changes to the legal language and verbiage that they so choose. As you've agreed upon the renewal, that will be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. And I can tell everyone here, there's no such thing as a standard form lease. Each landlord will have their own version of their own standard form lease. This leaves you exposed for provisions being inserted in that may or may not have been negotiated previously out of the lease. At a minimum rent to be determined between landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Meaning your rent's going one direction, going up. We were recently, just actually a couple of years ago, involved in a file back in 2016. A very prominent doctor in Florida. Now, for confidentiality purposes, I'm going to make up the name. Dr. Jane Doe. And this doctor has 3 offices, opened up the 3rd one back in 2006. Signed a 10-year lease with 2 5-year renewal options. In 2008, I believe everyone probably remembers what happened in the real estate market. It crashed. Fast forward to 2016. Dr. Jane Doe renewed her lease, expressed her option. The landlord was very kind, did a reasonable increase. It went from $32 a square foot to $33 a square foot. Yeah. Reasonable. The average in the area was $14 to $15 a square foot. Because he had this provision in his lease, that it will not be less, there was no reason for the landlord to offer him less. It goes on to say, if the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on the market rent within 60 days of the exercise by the tenant of its option to renew, the rent shall then be determined by arbitration based on market rent for renewing tenants in the building. What happens if you have a Dr. Jane Doe in the building? Paying significantly more. What happens if you have a Starbucks? Doctors, this is just one provision in your lease out of hundreds. And these are the number of different aspects of this one provision that can be detrimental to you and the practice. Not only in your practicing career, but when you eventually look to sell the practice and transition. The assignment section of your lease, or commonly known as the assignment and subletting section of your lease. This section essentially outlines the transferability of your lease in the event that you look to sell the practice. This verbiage is taken, it's about 75% of the dental office leases we review and have to renegotiate each year. Virtually verbatim. So as we go through, I encourage you, if you have your lease with you, take a look and compare. If the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it should first have received the consent of the landlord. Meaning, if you want to sell your practice and transfer the lease, you need to ask the landlord for permission. Not uncommon in commercial real estate. What's unusual about 75% of the leases that we review is the verbiage in which that consent can be withheld, denied, or what have you, which we'll actually touch on as well. Many of which may have the verbiage to see which consent will not be unreasonably withheld. And they think that protects you as a tenant. My question to each and every one of you today is, what's the definition of unreasonable? There isn't. It's ambiguous. Landlords love that type of language. It goes on to say, any request for such consent shall be in writing within 15 days following the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent. The landlord shall have the option to, 1, approve tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises. 2, decline tenant's request to assign the lease and sublet the premises. And or 3, to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. So A, approve, B, decline, or 3, terminate your lease. How would that affect your practice sale if they terminated your lease? No location, no business, no practice. It goes on to say, additionally, should the landlord consent to an assignment or sublet of the premises, landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then current market rent for the leased premises or 15% greater than the then current rent. Meaning, the landlord has the ability to increase rent at least 15%. Does that impact the sale of your practice? Could that be detrimental to a buyer who may just walk away? Would the buyer ask for a discount from you off the sale price because they now have to pay more in rent? Furthermore, should the tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash, goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of this lease or sublet of the premises that is over and above the current base rental rates payable to the landlord in any fiscal year during the term of the lease, the difference between the annual rental rate and such rental income, cash, goods, or other consideration shall be paid to the landlord directly within 30 days of the tenant's receipt thereof. Long short, you're looking to sell your practice for $1 million. The landlord is entitled to a percentage of those sale proceeds. The hard work, the blood, sweat, and tears you're putting into the practice day in, day out for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the landlord's going to try and take a chunk of that value. In most cases, virtually every case, the sale of a practice is at some way, shape, or form attributed or put towards a dentist retiring, their retirement fund. If we're unaware that the landlord can take a percentage of the proceeds, how is that going to impact our retirement plan? We were just asked to assist in a project about a month and a half ago where a doctor found a buyer. He'd been in the space, a general dentist, about 32 years, I believe it was, and he found a buyer conditional on the lease transferring to him. Everything else is agreed upon. He went to his landlord, which he had told us has been one of his patients for 25 years. They were quote-unquote friends. And the landlord replied, happy to consent to the transfer of the lease, congratulations, on one of two conditions. A, you give me 50% of your sale proceeds, 50, or B, the rent's increased by 30%. What would you choose? Because of the way his assignment subletting section was structured, it gave the landlord all of the leverage in the world to add conditions or leverage their consent to gain something from it. Whether the sale proceeds, increase in rent, whatever condition. Now this particular case, unfortunately, is one of the more extreme cases, but very common now for landlords to be asking for 10, 15, even sometimes 20% of the sale proceeds. Doctors, very important that we have the assignment and subletting section properly drafted. I'm sure all of you can appreciate you want the full value from the practice sale and not just a portion of it. It goes on to say, notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Meaning, even if the landlord agrees to transfer the lease, you will remain liable for those lease obligations if that buyer defaults. And you'll notice there's no expiry. I received a call from a doctor who had sold his practice, retired, moved out to California. He was on the beach when he received a call from his landlord 8 years later. 8 years after retiring and selling a practice. Buyer defaulted. Landlord was collecting. We need to ensure we either have release or limited liability after sale. We cannot leave it open-ended. We want to be able to sleep at night as we retire. But there's no liabilities that can affect our retirement. Absolutely critical. And again, these provisions, 75% of them, and we, again, negotiate over 1,000 leases each year, or represent 1,000 doctors each year, quote unquote, our dental specific attorney, and these are the type of language in the lease. A dental tenant is very specific. They need to know the nuances of what's in a dental lease and how it can impact not only the dentist in the short term, but the long term as well. Other traps in the office lease. So we didn't even have a chance today to touch on a demolition clause or a redevelopment right, whereby the landlord has the ability to terminate your lease, typically upon 30 days, if they decide to redevelop the property. The relocation provision, where the landlord has the ability to notify you, typically on 30 days as well, sometimes 60, that you have to relocate to a different unit within the building. And in majority of cases, you'll notice the way it's structured in the lease, they have the tenant paying for that cost. And as a dental tenant, as you may have found the investment in the current space you built, the same investment will be going into the new space. Or it won't say who's paying. In which case, again, it leaves you exposed to a very, very expensive problem. Financial statements. Many landlords will have the ability to request financial statements. And if you've provided a personal guarantee or are personally named on the lease, that's not only your practice financial statements, that's you personally. How comfortable are you with that? And again, doctors, these aren't the only provisions in the office lease. There are a number of other ones as well. Obviously, just can't fit them all on the page. The tenant lease cycle. As a dental tenant, as we know, it takes typically on average about 18 to 24 months to relocate a practice. From the moment you have the idea or the need to relocate, to finding the space, to negotiating the lease and the terms, to permits, construction, to doors open, 18 to 24 months on average, which is why we typically recommend dental tenants to begin 24 months from expiry. Time is leverage as a dental tenant. Too many dentists start too late. The less time there is on the lease, the more leverage the landlord has. Because they know they're in the profession that it takes a dental tenant and it's expensive to move, that you don't want to. They know this. So we need to be very cognizant on our critical dates. As I mentioned, not only just the expiry date, but the option to renew deadline as well. So as we move through the process to begin preparing for negotiations, 24 months prior to expiry is when we should all be preparing for the negotiation, meaning doing our background research. What's rent in the area? What is in our lease? What maybe was negotiated last time? What needs to be fixed? And ensure this is the time to address it. Because worst case scenario, for example, say for example the landlord was unwilling to renew the lease. We still have time to relocate. There would be nothing worse than being told 3 months prior to expiry because we were just late, missed dates, not paying attention, being told we're not renewing. We had a doctor who missed his option to renew deadline by 1 day. 1 day. The landlord already had out a for-lease sign, giant for-lease sign in front of his practice and the space, and had notified the doctor that he was showing dentists through the space throughout the week because he had permission to from the lease. We need to be aware of our critical dates and begin the process 2 years in advance. Now, one of the services that we provide here at Cirrus is a critical dates and risk analysis. Essentially what this is, it's about a $1,500 value, so $1,495. What is included is we spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing our lease. So we have our legal team go through with a fine-tooth comb, highlight all of the risks, exposures, and liabilities. Our leasing team will pull rent rates and comparables, the local market and the building, to determine are you overpaying in rent or is it fair. We'll then schedule a call with you, typically about an hour long, and we'll go through your vision and plan with the practice and yourself and your career plan. We'll go through the traps that we uncovered and what they mean to you and how they can impact you. Provide feedback on what the ideal lease should look like for you and how to negotiate effectively a tactical plan to rectify the situation or the direction to go. So again, this is a critical dates and risk analysis, or short form as well, a lease review. It's one of the services we provide. Now, that being said, for all attendees today on the webinar, because you have attended, you each receive a complimentary lease review, a critical dates and risk analysis, no charge. What I need from you is a copy of your lease, including any amendments and extensions and estoppels from the moment you signed originally to where we are now. We will then begin our due diligence and process in reviewing the documents, and then you need to let me know a few dates and times that you're available for about 1 hour, and I should be able to confirm one, and we'll be able to walk you through each step of the process. So if you would like a complimentary lease review or a critical dates and risk analysis, again, it is complimentary. Chef as well, let me know that you were on this webinar. But we do have a polling station that's just coming up. That way you can access it here, and I can be sure to send you a quick email that has all my information in it. Whether it's easier to scan an email or fax the documents over, just let me know. Now, I hope everyone enjoyed the webinar and the program today. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, even side questions, small questions, I'll be putting back on my contact information in just a moment. Feel free to reach out, give me a quick call, shoot me an email. Happy to answer any questions you may have or you want to bounce some ideas off of me and so forth. Happy to address those too. But it was a pleasure speaking with everyone. I hope you enjoyed the course and found it insightful. Looking forward to connecting with many of you over the next few days as well.